Most people over 60 believe that once dinner is over, their blood sugar is basically out of their hands until morning. But what if the last thing you drink before bed quietly shows up on your glucose meter the next day? Not magic. Not some secret the food industry is hiding from you. Something much simpler than that. And the drink that surprised me most on this list isn't the first one I'll mention. It comes a little later, so stick with me. Quick honesty check before we start. No drink erases years of habits overnight, and no drink is a cure. If anyone tells you 1 cup of something fixes your blood sugar while you sleep, be skeptical, the same way I am. But your evening routine still matters more than most people realize, and by the time we're done, I think you'll see exactly why that 1 hour before bed carries more weight than almost any other hour of the day. Margaret taught me that. 67, retired after 30 years teaching 3rd grade, and frustrated when her morning numbers kept running higher than she expected. For 3 mornings straight, she actually wondered if her glucose meter was broken, because the number didn't match anything she thought she'd done wrong. She'd eaten the same dinner she always ate. She hadn't skipped her metformin. She hadn't touched dessert. So when we finally sat down together and walked through her evening hour by hour, almost like reconstructing a timeline, we found it. A large glass of sweetened iced tea, sipped slowly in her recliner while she watched her shows before bed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing she would have ever called a problem. Just a quiet habit sitting in the 1 hour of the day her body was least equipped to handle it. We'll come back to her more than once, because what we eventually changed surprised us both. If you enjoy simple, doctor-backed health advice made especially for adults over 60, consider subscribing to Prime Health Insight. Every week we walk through practical ways to help you stay healthier, steadier, and more independent, without the fear tactics so many health videos rely on. Here's the one piece of biology that explains almost everything else in this video. During the day, your muscles work like a night shift crew that never clocks out, pulling sugar out of your bloodstream every single time you walk to the mailbox, climb a set of stairs, or just shift around in your chair. Lie down for the night and that crew goes home. The demand for fuel drops off almost completely right at the exact hours when certain hormones are quietly doing the opposite of what you'd want. So what happens to the sugar with nowhere to go? Nighttime inactivity, along with hormonal shifts that happen while you sleep, things like changes in cortisol and growth hormone that follow their own overnight rhythm, can push your body toward a higher overnight glucose response than the same food or drink would cause earlier in the day. That's the piece almost nobody explains, and it's why this one small window before lights out deserves more attention than most of us give it. It isn't that nighttime is dangerous. It's that nighttime is quiet, and quiet is exactly when small habits do their most unnoticed work. Before we get to the 5 drinks that can genuinely help, I want to spend just a moment on the ones that quietly work against you, because I see this mistake constantly in my own practice. Regular soda is the obvious one, but fruit juice trips up more people than you'd expect because it feels healthy. A small glass of orange juice before bed can raise blood sugar nearly as fast as soda, without the artificial ingredients, but without the benefit either. Sports drinks are another one people don't think twice about because the label says electrolytes instead of sugar, even though many of them are functionally the same thing in a different bottle. None of these are moral failures if you enjoy them during the day, but the hour before bed is exactly the wrong hour for any of them, for the same reason we just talked about. Nobody's muscles are asking for that fuel anymore. I'll add one more caution here because I get asked about it constantly. There's an entire aisle now of powders and supplement drinks marketed specifically for blood sugar, often with impressive-sounding names and a long list of ingredients on the label. Some of these products may contain reasonable, well-studied ingredients. The problem is that supplements aren't regulated the same way medications are, so the amount actually in the bottle doesn't always match the label, and interactions with existing diabetes medications aren't always well tested. I'm not telling you these are all useless or dangerous. I'm telling you that if you're curious about one, bring the actual bottle to your next appointment and let your doctor or pharmacist look at the ingredient list directly, rather than trusting marketing copy on a website to make that call for you. Let's start with the first drink, because I don't want to make you wait for it the way so many videos do. Unsweetened chamomile tea works on your blood sugar sideways, not head-on. It doesn't touch glucose directly, and I want to be upfront about that so nobody watching thinks I'm claiming otherwise. What it seems to do instead is quiet the nervous system, and that matters more than people expect. When we're stressed, even quietly stressed without fully noticing it, the body releases cortisol, a hormone whose original job, going back long before glucose meters existed, was to dump stored sugar into the blood so we could outrun danger. Nobody's outrunning anything at 10 at night while replaying tomorrow's to-do list in their head. But the cortisol still shows up anyway, like a thermostat that keeps kicking the heat on even though the room's already warm. A warm cup of chamomile, sipped slowly rather than gulped, is one small way to turn that thermostat down before it has the chance to nudge your numbers upward overnight. Margaret laughed the first time I suggested tea to her. She'd never been a tea person in her life, and she told me flatly that it felt like something her grandmother would drink, not her. I told her that was fine, and that the goal was never to turn her into someone else's version of healthy. It was just to see if it helped her numbers, which eventually it did. One small practical note, since I get asked this too: a proper cup, steeped for a full 5 minutes or so rather than dunking the bag for 30 seconds, tends to make a real difference in how calming it actually feels. A weak, rushed cup of chamomile is mostly just warm water with a suggestion of flavor, and it's the fuller strength version that seems to help people settle down. Here's the one I underestimated for years, and I mean genuinely avoided recommending: cinnamon-infused warm water. I want to be careful here, because cinnamon gets talked about online with far more confidence than the actual research supports, and I don't want to be one more voice adding to that noise. Real studies suggest a modest effect on how your body responds to insulin, the hormone that moves sugar out of the blood and into your cells. Picture insulin as a key and your cells as locked doors. In some people, especially with type 2 diabetes, those locks get a little rusty over time, and the key doesn't turn as smoothly as it used to. Some research suggests cinnamon may help that key turn a touch easier, though the studies disagree on exactly how much, and some show almost no effect at all. Modest is the operative word here. One practical note worth knowing: there are two common types of cinnamon, Ceylon, and cassia, the cheaper variety found in most grocery store spice jars, contains a compound called coumarin that isn't meant to be consumed in large amounts every single day. A small pinch, stirred into warm water, occasionally is not a concern for most people, but if you're planning on making this a nightly habit, Ceylon cinnamon is the gentler choice long-term. This was the change Margaret finally agreed to try, stirred right into her unsweetened iced tea so it still felt like her same evening ritual, just quietly rebuilt from the inside out. Third, a small glass of unsweetened tart cherry juice, diluted with water, because of something that has nothing to do with sugar at first glance. Tart cherries carry natural melatonin, the same hormone your brain uses to regulate sleep. And here's the connection most people never hear about. Poor sleep itself raises blood sugar, and it runs in both directions. Skimp on deep sleep, and your body becomes less sensitive to insulin the very next day, diabetes or not, in exactly the same way that key I mentioned earlier gets a little rustier from one bad night's rest. So a drink that gently supports sleep may help your morning numbers in a roundabout way too, not because it's acting on glucose directly, but because it's acting on the thing that so heavily influences glucose. One important caution, and I mean this one seriously: cherry juice still carries real natural sugar, more than chamomile or cinnamon water by a good margin, so portion control matters here more than with any other drink on this list. A small diluted amount, an ounce or two mixed into water, not a full glass straight from the bottle, and definitely not on top of dessert. When you're shopping for it, look specifically for unsweetened tart cherry juice rather than a cherry juice cocktail or blend, since the sweetened versions found near it on the same shelf can carry considerably more sugar per serving without necessarily saying so in large print on the front label. Fourth, and it sounds almost too simple to belong on a list like this: plain water. As we get older, our sense of thirst dulls, which is a strange but well-documented part of aging, and it means a lot of us walk around mildly dehydrated without ever actually feeling thirsty enough to notice. When you're low on fluid, your blood becomes more concentrated, like a garden hose running at half pressure, with the same amount of minerals packed into less water moving through it. Everything in that bloodstream, sugar included, gets a little more crowded as a result. Margaret admitted, almost sheepishly, that she'd nearly stopped drinking water after dinner entirely, worried about waking up for the bathroom in the middle of the night. That's a completely reasonable worry, by the way, and I don't want to dismiss it. The practical fix isn't to drink a large glass right before bed, which really can send you to the bathroom twice overnight. It's to make sure you're getting enough water earlier in the evening so that by the time you're actually lying down, your body isn't playing catch-up. It costs nothing, and it remains one of the safest habits on this entire list. Before the fifth drink, let me tell you about Robert, 71, who spent almost 4 decades working at a hardware store before he retired. Robert had tried everything for his blood sugar except changing one nightly ritual, a small glass of whiskey every single evening for 20 years. I want to pause here, because this is important to me, and I never want anyone watching this to feel shamed by what I'm about to say. Robert wasn't being reckless. It was one drink, genuinely enjoyed, part of a wind-down ritual that had nothing to do with overindulgence. But alcohol does something specific to blood sugar that surprises most people, no matter what kind it is. It can drop blood sugar too low in the hours after drinking, especially for anyone on certain diabetes medications, because the liver gets pulled off its normal overnight job of releasing small, steady amounts of sugar, and instead gets busy processing the alcohol first. Sugar can then rebound higher later, depending on the person, the amount, and what exactly they're drinking. I get asked sometimes whether red wine is different, since it gets talked about so often in the context of heart health. And the honest answer is that the evidence there is limited and mixed, not something I'd build a nightly habit around for blood sugar specifically. Unpredictable is exactly what you don't want happening while you're asleep and can't feel the early warning signs your body would otherwise give you. I'm not telling you to give up something you genuinely enjoy without a real conversation with your own doctor first. I am telling you it's worth bringing up at your next visit, especially if your mornings have been surprising you lately. Which brings us to the fifth drink, and it's the one people sometimes reach for instead of that nightcap once they've had that conversation: a small glass of warm milk. It might raise an eyebrow since milk does contain natural sugar in the form of lactose, and I don't want to gloss over that. But milk also carries protein, and protein acts like a spring-loaded hinge on a door instead of one that swings wide open, slowing the pace at which sugar enters your bloodstream rather than letting it all in at once. I want to be honest that the evidence here is limited and highly individual, so I'd call this a possible option worth asking about, rather than an expected benefit you should assume will apply to you specifically, especially if your sugar tends to run low overnight already. If regular dairy doesn't sit well with you, an unsweetened plant-based milk with a comparable amount of protein, some pea protein or soy versions fit that description, can work similarly, though the research specifically on those alternatives is thinner still. A specific conversation with your doctor or a dietitian matters more here than with almost anything else on this list, simply because there are more variables at play. One question I get almost every time I bring any of this up is timing. How long before bed should you actually have one of these drinks? My general answer is somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes before you actually lie down, for a couple of reasons. It gives anything with natural sugar, the cherry juice, or the milk a little time to be processed while you're still upright and at least somewhat active, rather than hitting your system the moment you lie flat. It also gives a warm drink like chamomile enough time to do its calming work before your head hits the pillow instead of being rushed. And practically speaking, it keeps the water and any diluted juice from turning into a 2 a.m. trip to the bathroom, which defeats the purpose of better sleep entirely. None of this needs to be precise to the minute. It's a general window, not a rule you need a timer for. Quick question for you. How many times do you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night? Hold that number in your head because it connects directly to something I want to explain now. one more patient because her story pulls everything else in this video together. Patricia, 63, came to see me not about her blood sugar directly, but because she was exhausted all the time and couldn't figure out why, no matter how early she went to bed. When we finally pulled up her numbers side by side, her sugar ran highest first thing in the morning, even though she hadn't eaten anything at all overnight. That confused her deeply, understandably. How does sugar climb from absolutely nothing? Here's the piece almost nobody explains, and it's one of the most misunderstood parts of blood sugar in people over 60. Your liver isn't idle while you sleep. It trickles out small, steady amounts of stored sugar overnight, so your brain has fuel to run on while you're not eating. And this is completely normal. It happens in every single person, diabetic or not. But in some people, especially as we age, or once insulin resistance has built up over years, the liver releases a bit more than it strictly should, particularly after a stressful evening, a poor night's sleep, or a drink that spiked things right before bed. It's sometimes called the dawn phenomenon, and it explains why some people wake up to numbers that seem to make absolutely no sense at all, numbers that feel like a betrayal after a night where they did everything right. I want to be clear that the dawn phenomenon itself isn't something a drink alone fixes, since it's rooted in your body's own hormonal rhythm rather than anything you consumed. But the evening choices we've talked about tonight, less overnight sugar in the system, better sleep quality, less cortisol running in the background, can all influence how pronounced that morning rise ends up being for you personally. For Patricia, the fix wasn't one single drink. It was 3 changes stacked together, none of them dramatic on their own. A more consistent bedtime instead of drifting off whenever she happened to feel tired, swapping her evening soda for sparkling water with a splash of lime, and a small cup of chamomile instead of scrolling on her phone until midnight. 3 unglamorous changes, but 3 months later, her mornings were noticeably steadier, and just as important to her, she told me she finally felt rested for the first time in years, which had been the whole reason she'd come to see me in the first place. If someone you love struggles with blood sugar swings or wakes up confused by numbers they can't explain, consider sending them this video. Sometimes one piece of information changes how a person looks at their entire evening. A few quick questions I hear often enough that I want to answer them directly. What about decaf coffee at night? For most people, plain decaf itself has very little direct effect on blood sugar, though it's worth remembering that decaf isn't always fully caffeine-free, and caffeine late in the day can still disrupt sleep for some people, which loops right back to the sleep and glucose connection we already talked about. What about a small protein shake before bed instead of any of these 5? Some people do use this approach, and the protein slows absorption idea is similar to what's happening with milk. But many protein shakes on store shelves contain added sugars or sweeteners you'd want to check the label for first. And why not just have a small snack instead of a drink? You certainly can, and for some people, a small protein-based snack works well. But drinks are simply easier to keep consistent, easier to measure, and easier to build into a nightly ritual the same way Margaret already had one, just with a different glass in her hand, instead of a new habit built from scratch. Here's the part I most want you to hear, out of everything in this video. None of this is about willpower or being disciplined enough. So many patients over 60 sit across from me almost apologizing, as if their numbers are some kind of personal failing they should have prevented. I push back on that every single time I hear it. Genetics, decades of habits nobody ever taught you to question, medications, stress, sleep, most of what shapes your blood sugar sits outside anything you control by simply trying harder. Paying closer attention, the way you're doing right now by watching this, already puts you ahead of where you were yesterday. If you're wondering how to actually put all of this together tonight rather than trying to remember 5 separate facts, here's the simplest way I explain it to my own patients. Pick one drink from this list, not all 5. 1. Give it a full 2 weeks before judging whether it's making a difference, because a single night rarely tells you anything reliable. Keep a small note of your morning numbers next to whatever change you made, even just scribbled on a notepad by your coffee maker, because memory alone tends to blur after a few days. And bring whatever you notice back to your own doctor, since they're the only one who can weigh it against your specific medications and history. I mentioned starting with just one because of a patient named David, 68, who watched a video almost exactly like this one and, in his own words, went all in the very same night. Chamomile, cinnamon water, a splash of cherry juice, and a glass of milk, all in the same evening, within about an hour of each other. Two things happened. First, he genuinely couldn't tell me which part was actually helping because he'd changed everything at once. And second, he'd unintentionally added a fair amount of extra fluid and a bit more natural sugar than he realized, stacked together, right before bed. Nothing harmful happened to him, but it taught both of us the same lesson. One change, held steady long enough to actually learn something from it, beats 5 changes thrown at the wall on the same night. That's the whole system. Nothing complicated, nothing that requires an app or a subscription or a special ingredient you can't find at a normal grocery store. Before I close, something directly for anyone watching this who is on medication for diabetes, whether that's metformin, insulin, or anything else. Please don't change your evening routine, your medications, or your diet in a meaningful way without talking to your own doctor first. Anything with natural sugar mentioned here, milk, cherry juice, needs to be weighed carefully against your specific prescriptions and your specific numbers, especially if there's any risk of going too low overnight while you're asleep and can't respond to the warning signs. Consider everything in this video the start of a conversation with your physician, never a replacement for one. They know your full history in a way no video, mine included, ever could. Tonight, somewhere, someone is going to reach for the same sugary drink they've had for 20 years without thinking twice about it, out of pure habit, the same way Margaret did for longer than she probably wants to admit. I hope that after watching this, that someone might be you, just with a different glass in your hand. I still picture Margaret in her recliner, watching her shows, holding that different glass, understanding the why behind it instead of just following a rule someone handed her. Small choices, repeated quietly night after night, are often the reason tomorrow's numbers look different than they used to, even when nothing else about the day changed at all. You don't have to change everything tonight. Pick one thing. A glass of water earlier in the evening instead of none at all. That conversation with your doctor about the nightcap you've had for years. Lights off 20 minutes earlier than usual. One step, kept up consistently, tends to matter more than any dramatic overnight overhaul ever could. I'm glad you spent this time with me today, and I mean that sincerely. Take care of yourself tonight, get some real rest, and I'll see you in the next video.